The air in the car smelled faintly of pine and aging leather, the kind that clings to fabric long after the weekend is over. My husband was humming softly to a song I didn't recognize, tapping the steering wheel with a sense of rhythmic optimism that made me feel, oddly, even lonelier. I looked out the window as we approached the countryside. Trees like tired guards lined the road, their leaves curling from the late summer heat. We hadn't been to the family cabin in over a year. He thought it might be refreshing to unplug for a couple of days. I had agreed too quickly. There was a fatigue in our routine, a silence in our touch, but not the kind born of conflict, just flatness. He was kind. He listened. He remembered to buy my favorite tea, but he hadn't really looked at me in weeks. And maybe, even more truthfully, I hadn't tried to be seen. When we arrived, the porch creaked under our weight like it always had. The cabin smelled of dust, pine, and old books, familiar and quietly indifferent. And then he appeared. His father, or rather his stepfather, taller than I remembered, broader across the shoulders. He wore a plain t-shirt, the sleeves rolled up, revealing the kind of arms shaped more by work than workouts. His hair was more silver than last year, but his posture was steady, movements unhurried. He looked like someone who'd never needed anyone's approval to exist. "Long drive?" he asked, nudging the screen door open with his elbow as he carried a box of tools. "Not too bad," I replied, quickly adjusting my shirt where the seatbelt had pulled it. His eyes paused on mine, just a moment longer than needed. Not inappropriate, but not disengaged either. The first evening passed like 1,000 others. Unpacking, slicing tomatoes, small talk over dinner. My husband was cheerful, nostalgic. He poured wine. His stepfather spoke little, only joining in when addressed directly. But I noticed how his gaze, not in a way that crossed lines, but with attention, whenever I spoke, or laughed too freely. Later, I offered to wash the dishes. The kitchen window faced the woods, wide and quiet. As I stood barefoot on the cold tile, sleeves rolled up, I sensed him nearby. Not close, juste présent. Reaching into a drawer beside me, our shoulders brushed. It meant nothing, but I noticed how steady my breath became. "Does the plumbing still rattle when you turn on hot water?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. He didn't answer right away. "Only when you rush it. It needs patience." I looked up. I wasn't sure if he meant the pipes, or if he did, entirely. The ambiguity unsettled me, then intrigued me, and then it passed. He left the kitchen. I finished cleaning alone. That night, my husband snored softly beside me while I lay awake. The sheets felt too crisp, the mattress too small. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the brush of a shoulder, the subtle tones in his voice. It was probably nothing. I told myself so. The next morning, I woke early. I wanted to shower before the hot water turned temperamental. As I stepped into the hallway, steam slipped from beneath the bathroom door. I paused. I hadn't heard anyone get up. The door creaked open. He stepped out, towel around his shoulders, hair damp, skin flushed from the steam. I was wearing a thin camisole and shorts. Hadn't expected anyone else to be awake. For a second, neither of us moved. He nodded politely, stepping aside. "Bathroom's yours." His voice was even, calm. "Thanks," I replied, a bit too fast. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, pulse quickening. That image stayed with me through the day. Not because of attraction, not in a direct way, but because of the quiet confidence he carried. And in contrast, I realized, I couldn't remember the last time I felt noticed like that. Not admired, not flattered, just, that evening, the three of us sat on the porch with drinks. My husband talked about fixing the shutters. His stepfather watched the trees in silence. "You've got a good woman," he said suddenly, still looking forward. "Just don't forget she's not background noise." I glanced up, surprised.
Marius Banchekuld, a little confused.
"Of course not," he said, but I wasn't sure who the remark was truly meant for, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had quietly changed, not in what was said, but in what was quietly acknowledged. The next morning began with the sound of eggs cracking and the steady clink of utensils against cast iron. I lay still for a while, listening through the thin cabin walls. It was quiet, except for an occasional low voice, his, probably commenting on the stove or how the eggs turned out. My husband had gone out to check the car's suspension. He always found something to fix when we were away from the city. It made him feel useful. I got up slowly, letting my feet find the cold wooden floor, and pulled on a loose cotton dress. The straps slipped slightly down my shoulders, but I didn't adjust them. The neckline dipped lower than I'd normally wear around family, but I told myself it was just too early to care. The truth was, I felt strange in my own skin, aware and alert in a way that had little to do with rest. He was in the kitchen, his back to me, focused on the pan. He glanced over his shoulder when I entered. Hungry? I nodded and sat, pretending to scroll my phone. The screen was off. My husband called from outside, needing a specific tool. He asked if I'd mind driving with his stepfather to the nearby farmer's market. He knows the place better, he said. You can pick out that sourdough you like. I agreed without hesitation. Later, I'd replay that choice. How easily I said yes. The ride was quiet at first. The road curved gently through trees and hills. Sunlight filtered through the leaves. The windows were half down. The wind moved my hair across my face. I didn't brush it away. He didn't speak for nearly 20 minutes. Then, without turning, he said, "You ever wonder what it feels like to be noticed again?" His voice was even, like asking if I preferred red or white onions. Not just liked, not just loved, but noticed. I didn't respond, but the words lingered inside me, warm, unsettled. I understood. At the market, everything felt too vivid. The tomatoes were too red, the peaches too sweet. I stayed longer at the bread stall just to breathe. When we loaded the bags into the trunk, our hands brushed. Neither of us commented. On the way back, it happened. About 20 minutes from the cabin, he pulled over near a small clearing. Brake lights felt off, he said, and stepped out. But instead of checking the back, he lit a cigarette and walked a few paces toward the trees. I followed, telling myself I needed air too. The forest was quiet, leaves whispering above us. He turned and held my gaze for a moment that felt longer than it should have. "I shouldn't have said that earlier," he murmured. "You said what you meant," I replied. He looked at me, not with intent, but with recognition. "You're not as invisible as you think," he said softly. There was no plan, no sharp moment of decision. I stepped closer, because I wanted to. My hand found the fabric of his shirt, warm from the sun. His fingers brushed my jaw steady, and then we kissed. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was quiet, measured, like something waiting patiently for permission.
When he stepped back, my hand trembled slightly.
We didn't say anything more. We returned to the car in near silence. The rest of the drive passed like a blur. Trees outside, still and distant. The radio stayed off. At the cabin, my husband greeted us with a smile.
Et qui said my chic.
I let him. My thoughts were... While they unloaded the bags, I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat quietly for a moment. In the mirror, I didn't look guilty, just awakened, like I had stepped into something long forgotten. Later, when we sat down to eat, I noticed how carefully I avoided his gaze, and how often he didn't avoid mine. My husband poured wine, his hand brushing mine. I smiled at him, but my body still remembered other details. The texture of worn cotton, the scent of pine and smoke. And in those fragments, I remembered a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. We left the market behind us, but not everything was left there. There, that moment stayed with me, not just on my lips, but in how I moved, how I breathed, how I noticed the world. It was like someone had sharpened the focus. Everything was suddenly too clear, too vivid. My husband's jokes, once familiar, now seemed distant. Not because they were bad, but because I could feel how distracted he was. Even when I laughed, he didn't really look. He didn't ask why. By the time we returned, the cabin was warm with evening air and the smell of dinner. I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, slicing cucumbers and herbs for a salad I didn't truly want. My hands moved on their own. I was remembering the way he'd looked at me, the silence that had said more than words. I'd expected to feel guilt. Instead, there was something else. Anticipation, maybe even fear, both growing inside me, side by side. Dinner passed like any other, the three of us at the small wooden table, sharing dishes, trading polite conversation.
The waltz felt closer. The lighting softer than usual.
My husband talked about the week ahead, needing to drop by the office on Monday for some delayed reports. I nodded, passed the pepper, sipped my wine. He, his stepfather, was mostly quiet, listening,
Observing.
Now and then, he'd offer a dry comment or react to a story with a shake of his head. But mostly, not just me, both of us. He listened in a way that made your words feel heavier, more deliberate. It was unsettling and magnetic. At one point, as I reached to pour water, my bracelet slipped. He adjusted it wordlessly, a small, simple motion, just a brush of his fingers. My husband didn't notice, but I did. That touch stayed with me. Later, while my husband was in the shower, I stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists far from the city. I leaned on the railing, looking out into the dark. I wasn't confused. I knew what had started, and more than that, I knew what I was beginning to want. He joined me after a while, standing a few feet away. We didn't speak for some time. Only the soft creak of the porch under our feet filled the silence. I shouldn't have let that happen today, I said finally, voice low. He looked toward the trees.
You qui said me.
I know. A pause. Then, without turning, he asked, "Do you regret it?" I didn't answer. He already knew. It wasn't really a question. It was something else. A way of remembering. A way of checking where the line now stood. The next morning, everything went on as if we were still just family. Still normal. But something hung between us. Something quiet but impossible to ignore. I became aware of his footsteps before he entered a room. Of his presence, even before I turned. That day, my husband announced he had to leave for 2 days. A sudden work trip that couldn't be delayed. He seemed frustrated, but also oddly relieved. Like being away from something he couldn't quite name made the choice easier. I acted disappointed, but inside, a quiet energy began to build. That evening, after he packed and went to bed early, I sat alone in the living room, a book open on my lap that I never read. Down the hall, I could hear his stepfather, the quiet sounds of drawers and cabinets. Eventually, I got up, maybe because stillness no longer felt possible. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw him by the window.
Moonlight stretched across the wooden floor.
He didn't turn. "He'll be gone 2 nights, I said, more fact than question. I know. I moved closer, but didn't touch him. I don't know what I'm doing. My voice was quieter than I expected. He stayed calm. You're doing what feels real. We stood in that silence, 2 heartbeats from something we hadn't named, and hadn't crossed again. I'm not proud of what I want, I admitted. He turned to face me. Then at least be honest with yourself. His words weren't sharp. They were steady and unflinching. That night, I lay next to my husband in the dark, listening to his breathing slow as he fell asleep. I stared at the ceiling, thoughts circling, and across the hall was a man who had said less in 2 days than my husband had in a week, but who had seen me more clearly in a single moment. I hadn't touched him again, not yet, but I knew I would, not because I was lost, but because something inside me had awakened. He left early, before the sun had fully risen. From the bedroom, I heard the car engine, that familiar soft growl echoing in the still morning air around the cabin. I didn't get up to say goodbye. I stayed in bed, eyes open, waiting for silence to return. Only when it did, only when I knew he was gone, did I breathe fully for the first time in hours. The house shifted with his absence. It felt larger, but not empty. I pulled the sheet around myself and lay still, eyes fixed on the faded ceiling pattern. I had choices. I could clean the kitchen, take a long walk through the woods, call someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. But none of those ideas touched me. Eventually, I rose, barefoot. I walked to the bathroom and turned on the tap. The cold water took a moment. As I waited, I looked at the shadows beneath my eyes, the faint flush in my cheeks, the kind that had lingered from the day before.
There was something new in my face.
Not softness, not romance. It was awareness.
A qui-current of something alive, almost dangereux.
I chose my clothes with more care than I admitted. A linen blouse, pale gray, fitted slightly at the waist, open just enough at the collarbone to feel deliberate. I left the second button undone. Underneath, I wore fabric that made me feel grounded, not for appearance, but for how it reminded me of myself. He came late that morning, just after I'd folded laundry. A soft knock, almost hesitant. When I opened the door, he stood with a small bag and a folded note. "Wrench and sealant," he said. "Thought I'd fix that leak under the cabinet, while no one's here to interrupt." I moved aside. He stepped in. The energy between us had shifted again, no longer tense, not loaded with guilt. It was quieter now. He moved through the space like he belonged there, like the need for explanation had passed. I sat at the kitchen table while he knelt under the sink, pulling tools from his bag. The room filled with the sounds of work, metal tapping metal, a quiet breath drawn when something tightened. I watched how he moved, steady, focused, unhurried. There was no performance, no flirtation. And yet, the hour passed with a closeness more real than words. When he stood to wipe his hands, our eyes met. We said nothing. I rose and stepped toward him, not quickly, but like someone who had already made peace with the moment. Close enough to notice the warmth on his skin, the lines near his mouth. "I thought about yesterday," I said, "more than I should have." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I added, "but I haven't stopped remembering it since." His gaze lowered briefly, then returned to mine. "I could go." "You could," I agreed, "but you won't." This time, there was no pause.
No question.
I reached out and placed my hand gently on his chest, feeling the quiet rhythm beneath. He mirrored the gesture. His fingers brushed along my arm, stopping with intent at my side. And then I kissed him, not hesitant,
Not incertain.
It was quiet, but honest.
À moment où nos spaces left fort potence ordoniale.
We didn't speak after that, not for some time. He stayed for lunch. We sat at the same table where my husband and I had eaten days ago. I sliced bread. He handed me a napkin. It could have been ordinary, but something in the space between us said otherwise. His eyes followed the turn of my head. Mine caught on the way his hand curved around the table's edge. Sunlight crept along the wooden floor, marking the hours. When he stood to leave, I didn't ask him to stay. He didn't say when he'd return, but we both understood. Something now lived between the lines, a door left slightly open, a silence with meaning. After he left, I stood in front of the mirror again. A faint mark of color near my lip caught my eye, soft, blurred. I wiped it away without